The humming of the servers filled the room with a familiar, rhythmic drone as Elena Rivers adjusted the headset perched lightly on her ears. She was used to the silence of the underground facility, used to the cold, sterile air and the flickering lights that barely illuminated the long rows of computer screens. Her job as a communications specialist for the Global Defense Network was not glamorous, but it had its moments of intrigue. Every so often, she found herself deep within the streams of encrypted data, her fingers flying over the keys as she combed through surveillance footage or satellite signals. But today, something was different. There was a new, untraceable pulse in the system. Elena leaned forward, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, her heart quickening. A flicker across her screen, then another. A signal, buried deep in the network. It was almost imperceptible, like a whisper beneath the static. But it was there. Her eyes narrowed, adjusting the settings on her monitor as she ran a diagnostic check, expecting to see nothing more than a routine anomaly. But the data didn't add up. There was no identifiable source. Her brow furrowed in confusion as the signal continued, uninterrupted, a low-frequency hum beneath the usual communications channels. She wasn't alone in the facility. Other specialists were monitoring their own stations, running similar diagnostics, but no one else had noticed. No one had reported anything out of the ordinary. To most, the hum was just another glitch, another fleeting data anomaly. To Elena, however, it felt different. The air seemed thicker somehow, as if the building itself had taken a deep, collective breath. She activated the audio feed cautiously. The voice that came through was not what she had expected. It was unlike anything she had ever heard. Its tone was alien, emotionless, but laced with an unsettling confidence. A shiver ran down her spine. "We are watching you. Your world is our prize. You are not as powerful as you think." Elena's hands froze on the keyboard. She blinked twice, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. Her eyes darted to the source tracker. Nothing. The voice wasn't originating from any of the usual communication networks. It wasn't coming from Earth. She quickly tried to trace the signal, tapping commands into the system, but the source kept changing, hopping between frequencies too fast for her to pin down. Panic gripped her chest as the screen flickered, glitching in and out, and the voice repeated its chilling message. "We are watching you. Your world is our prize. You are not as powerful as you think." Elena's breath hitched as her heart raced. She reached for the emergency protocol button, ready to alert her superiors, but something in the pit of her stomach told her to pause, to hesitate. The voice seemed too deliberate, too cold. She wasn't sure if it was a threat, a warning, or something worse. She quickly scanned the feed. It wasn't just the message, it was the way it made her feel. It wasn't an ordinary broadcast. The words themselves seemed to ripple through her consciousness, bending reality in strange ways. She could almost hear the whisper in the back of her mind, like a voice that wasn't coming through the speakers, but directly into her thoughts. "No, I can't let this go unnoticed," she thought. Elena hit the emergency button, triggering the facility's highest alert. The monitor's screen flashed red, a warning to anyone in the building that something was wrong. She gathered herself, forcing her mind to focus, but the unease had already begun to spread through her thoughts like a poison. The voice was back. "Humanity's time is over. You have been judged." Her pulse quickened, the words searing into her brain, but the panic she expected didn't come. Instead, something else stirred within her. A gnawing curiosity, a need to understand. She was no longer just listening to a signal, she was experiencing it. "What is this?" A sudden chill washed over Elena as she reached for her notebook, scribbling the strange words, hoping to make sense of them later. Her fingers trembled as she double-checked the data feed. Again, the source was a moving target. Whoever, or whatever, was broadcasting this message was not just using the global communication networks, they were manipulating them, bypassing security protocols with ease. But why, and who was behind this? The urgency of her thoughts was interrupted by a flash on the monitor. Alert, security breach detected. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't just the signal that was wrong. The entire global network was under attack. She quickly ran a security audit on the system, watching the results flash across her screen. Unauthorized data streams had begun to flood the network. Encrypted data, hard to trace, impossible to block without shutting down the entire system. The voice had done more than invade the airwaves. It had infiltrated the heart of global defense. Elena's mind raced. This wasn't a hack. This was something else. A message had been broadcasted, and it had torn through their infrastructure like paper. Before she could react, the voice spoke again, clearer this time. "There is no escape. We will come for you." His voice was stronger, more forceful now, as though it had gathered power, consolidating itself into something far more dangerous than just a whisper in the air. Elena tried to regain control, but the system was slipping away from her. Every key she pressed seemed to get swallowed by an unseen force, and then, suddenly, all went silent. The hum, the voice, gone. For a brief, surreal moment, Elena wondered if she had imagined it. But deep down, she knew it had been real. Too real. The taste of blood seeped into her mouth. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of her quickened breaths. The clock on her screen blinked in the background, almost as though the time itself had been suspended. Then the first alarm went off, an emergency broadcast warning. She quickly scanned the message. Global communications network failure. All channels compromised. Proceed with caution. She jumped to her feet, her mind racing. The breach had gone far beyond the walls of this facility. It was everywhere. "Alina?" a voice called from behind her. She spun around to see one of her colleagues, Michael, standing in the doorway, his face pale. He had been monitoring the situation from a different station, but from the look on his face, it was clear he had experienced something similar. "You heard it too?" Elena asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Michael nodded, his expression grave. "It's not just us. It's global. The signal's all over." "I tried tracing it," Elena said, her words coming quickly. "But I couldn't find the source. It's moving too fast." "Did you hear what it said?" Michael asked, his voice shaking. "The message, what does it mean?" Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled up a list of the latest transmissions from across the globe. Major communication hubs in Moscow, New York, Tokyo, and London were all showing signs of the same interference. And it wasn't just the words of the broadcast. There was something more, a distortion in the human psyche. She could see it in the footage coming from the cities. People were reacting, but not like they had in the past. It wasn't just confusion. It was as if the broadcast was awakening something inside them, something dark, primal, and violent. "It's spreading," she whispered, more to herself than to Michael. A chilling thought crossed her mind. What if this wasn't a signal at all? What if it was something more? Something designed not just to communicate, but to control. "Michael," Elena said, urgency creeping into her voice, "we need to find the source before it's too late." Michael hesitated for a moment. "Where do we even start? The network's compromised. The whole world is—" "We start by tracing the origin of the signal," Elena interrupted, determination flooding her system. "We need to find out who is behind this, and why they're doing it." The thought of facing a force that had already infiltrated the world's most secure systems sent a cold shiver through her. Whoever, or whatever, was behind the broadcast, they were playing a game with humanity, one where the rules had yet to be revealed. But one thing was certain. It wasn't just a broadcast. It was a warning, and Elena had to find out what it meant before the darkness it had unleashed consumed everything. Elena stood in the middle of the control room, the faint hum of the servers and the blinking lights from the monitors her only company. The panic that had briefly gripped her seemed to fade, but something darker and more insidious began to settle in its place. The signal that had breached the global defense network was an intrusion. It was an invasion of the mind. She glanced at Michael, whose face was pale and drawn. His eyes flicked from one screen to another, as though seeking some answer that was slipping away from him. "Are you seeing this?" he asked, his voice strained. Elena nodded slowly. The footage on the screen before them flickered between different cities: Moscow, New York, Tokyo, London. Each one was showing signs of distress, traffic chaos, people in the streets shouting, groups of individuals attacking each other without apparent reason. In some places, entire neighborhoods were descending into pandemonium. All in others, groups had gathered in wild, almost religious fervor. It was as if a switch had been flipped in humanity's collective mind, and no one knew what to do next. "What the hell is going on?" Michael muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I mean, these are just random people, right? Why are they this?" Elena's stomach churned as she stared at the madness unfolding on the screen. The images weren't just disturbing, they were deeply unsettling. They felt wrong in a way she couldn't fully articulate. A primal rage had been unleashed. It wasn't the kind of chaos that followed a natural disaster, nor was it the result of some engineered virus. It was something far more insidious. "Elena, we need to get to the source," Michael said, his voice tight. "We have no idea what we're dealing with." She snapped her gaze toward him, her mind racing. He was right, the moment she'd heard the voice. Its cold, emotionless tone speaking words that felt more like a command than a warning. She'd known that whatever this was, it wasn't some random act of violence. The message had purpose. It had intent. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the madness now spreading across the world wasn't just a consequence of a random broadcast. It was an awakening to something that had been buried deep within humanity's psyche. She turned back to her terminal, typing rapidly. The source of the broadcast was still moving, hopping between frequencies too quickly for her to trace. She narrowed her eyes at the data, a growing sense of frustration gnawing at her. Every time she thought she was closing in on it, the signal would scramble, slipping through her fingers like smoke. "This isn't just a signal," Elena said, more to herself than to Michael. "It's a message, a contagion, and it's spreading." Michael was silent for a moment, processing what she had said. His gaze remained fixed on the images of chaos flashing across the screens. A woman in London was on top of a car shouting at the crowd below, and in New York, a group of people were throwing Molotov cocktails at police officers. The anger, the violence, the sheer madness. It was like the broadcast had unlocked something inside these people, something buried deep in their unconscious minds. "They're not just hearing the message," Michael said finally, his voice a little shaken. "It's affecting them, mentally, physically." Elena nodded, tapping the keys in a frenzied rhythm, trying to get a more accurate read on the signal. "I think it's triggering something in their brains, some kind of primal, instinctual response." She paused, glancing up at Michael. "I don't think this is random, Mike. I don't think this is some isolated hacking attempt. Whoever did this, they've studied us. They've studied the way we think, the way we react." "Share my solution." A chill ran down her spine as she imagined the mind behind the broadcast, the calculating, deliberate tone of the voice, the way it seemed to know exactly how people would react. It was as if it had anticipated every possible outcome and used it to trigger the most violent, uncontrollable impulses in humanity. "Then what do we do?" Michael asked, his voice edged with panic. Elena didn't answer right away. There was no clear answer. She didn't know how to stop it, how to undo the damage already done. The broadcast was still out there, and as far as she could tell, it wasn't just a message. It was a weapon. "I don't know yet," she said, shaking her head, "but I need to trace this thing. I need to find out where it's coming from. If I can't stop it, maybe I can find out who's behind it." There was no time to waste. Elena grabbed her bag and slung it over her shoulder. "I'm heading to the main communications hub. We've got a better chance of tracing the signal from there." Michael looked at her, his expression darkening. "I'm coming with you." It wasn't a question. The urgency in his voice was undeniable, and Elena didn't have the time or the energy to argue. Together they left the control room and made their way down the sterile corridors, the low hum of the facility reverberating in the air around them. The building was eerily quiet now, a stark contrast to the chaos consuming the outside world. The silence felt wrong, out of place. It was as though the very walls of the facility had absorbed the tension, the fear that had spread through the network. They arrived at the central communications hub, a massive room filled with rows of terminals and data streams from all over the world. The walls were lined with massive monitors, each one displaying footage from different cities, riots, protests, and disturbances. But what struck Elena most was the absolute lack of order. The hub, which had once been a well-oiled machine, was now in disarray. Technicians scrambled at their stations, trying desperately to regain control of the failing networks. Elena took a deep breath and approached one of the lead engineers. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos. The engineer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, barely glanced up from his station. "We're under attack, ma'am. The global defense network is compromised. Everything's being overridden by some kind of unknown signal. We've lost contact with several sectors already. The broadcast, it's everywhere." Elena nodded grimly. "I need access to the tracking system. Now." I felt the other side of her mind. The engineer hesitated, but then, seeing the urgency in her eyes, nodded and motioned for her to follow him. He led her to a control panel that was flashing red, indicating a system-wide breach. Elena placed her hands on the keyboard, running a series of commands to access the transmission logs. "Potentiality," it was Peter. "He has a way of doing that." The data was a mess, scrambled and fragmented, but she could see a pattern emerging. The signal was coming from multiple locations at once, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint the exact origin. It was like a wave, spreading outward, overlapping in such a way that it seemed to defy the laws of physics. As Elena continued her search, she noticed something strange: the frequency at which the signal was transmitting. It wasn't just any standard broadcast. It was designed to reach every single communication network on Earth. It was manipulating satellite frequencies, radio waves, and even cellular networks. There was no escape. The broadcast was everywhere, embedded in every communication channel. "Mike," Elena said, her voice tight with realization, "this wasn't just a one-off hack. This is global warfare. Whoever's behind this is playing the long game." Michael was silent for a moment, processing her words. "So, this isn't just an attack. It's manipulation. It's designed to make us lose control of ourselves." Elena nodded, her mind racing. "Exactly. This is more than just chaos. It's a calculated effort to destabilize humanity at its core. It's making people question their reality. It's a psychological weapon." Her fingers flew over the keys as she traced the signal further, her heart pounding in her chest. The more she uncovered, the more terrifying it became. This was no ordinary transmission. It was an intelligent, self-sustaining broadcast, a force of its own, one that could not only manipulate communication networks, but also warp human perception. "Wait," she muttered, zooming in on the latest transmission logs. "There's something else. There's a pattern hidden in the data. It's like a code buried in the signal. Michael leaned over her shoulder, his breath catching as he saw what she was seeing. A series of complex symbols hidden within the static, like a secret language. A language that could only be deciphered by someone who understood its design. Thanks to the eventual appearance of the elderly from the last World War, the manuscript was destroyed. I can't fully decrypt it, Elena admitted. But we're getting closer. Whoever's behind this, they want us to understand it. They want us to see this. Exhalation. So calm, so still, it was almost marvelous. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, ready to enter a command that could potentially lead to the source of the broadcast. But before she could act, the lights in the hub flickered. A loud siren echoed through the room, signaling another breach in the system. Elena turned toward Michael, her mind racing. Get ready. We may not have much time. The chaos was no longer contained within the network. It was spilling out into the real world. The countdown had begun, and Elena knew that if she didn't find the origin of the broadcast soon, the consequences would be irreversible. As the sirens continued to blare, she typed one final command into the system. Come on, she whispered, her heart racing. The screen flickered. The answer was just within reach. The room buzzed with an unsettling tension as the siren echoed through the facility, signaling another breach in the security system. Elena's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her mind frantically calculating the next steps. The monitors were filled with live feeds from all over the world, people rioting in the streets, entire cities in disarray. The chaos wasn't just the result of random violence. Something was wrong, something far deeper. The broadcast had triggered a violent psychological break in the global population, and Elena needed to find out why before it escalated further. We can't let it spread anymore, Michael said, his voice edged with panic. What's the next move? Elena didn't answer immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the screen, where lines of cryptic symbols flashed across the encrypted data. Beneath the chaos of the broadcasts, hidden in the signal's digital noise, she had found it. A code. It was faint at first, an indistinguishable pattern of binary fragments and algorithmic shifts. But now it was becoming clearer, as though the signal was intentionally revealing itself, piece by piece. As she typed in a few more commands, the symbols began to form recognizable patterns. Complex, highly sophisticated, almost alien in nature. This isn't just data corruption, Elena said quietly, more to herself than to Michael. It's a language. She leaned forward, trying to focus on the decryption process. Every second felt like an eternity as the algorithm worked to untangle the strands of code. But time was running out. The breach was escalating. As much as she tried to concentrate, a part of her was aware of the world outside, of the pandemonium spreading like wildfire. I don't understand, Michael said, shaking his head. How can this be happening? Who could do something like this? Elena's eyes flicked up to meet his. He looked tired, his face pale and drawn from the pressure, but there was also fear in his eyes. He had seen the footage too. He had witnessed the madness spreading across the globe, people attacking one another without reason, violence unprovoked. And it wasn't just the violence. It was the sudden surge of rage, a deep, burning wrath that was consuming humanity at its core. It's not just random violence, Elena replied, a grim realization creeping over her. This broadcast, it's triggering something in them. It's awakening something. Something? Michael's voice was laced with disbelief. What do you mean, something? Elena clenched her jaw, her mind whirring with the implications of what she was discovering. The broadcast wasn't just a signal designed to spread chaos. It was designed to provoke something far more dangerous. A primal, instinctual response. A return to a raw, violent nature that had been buried beneath the surface of civilization for centuries. The code was almost fully decrypted now. Elena could feel the weight of her discovery bearing down on her. Her breath quickened as she tapped the final key, the screen flashing as the last part of the message appeared. The text that filled the screen wasn't just the kind of message she expected from an ordinary hacker. It was a manifesto, an ultimatum, a declaration of war. We have awakened your true nature. We are the architects, and you are our creation. You are nothing without us. We will remake you in our image. Your time is over. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Her chest tightened and her throat went dry. She could hear Michael's sharp intake of breath behind her, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen. The architects? Michael asked, his voice hoarse. What does that even mean? Who are they? I don't know, Elena murmured, her mind spinning. But it's not just a signal. It's an invasion of our minds, of our very sense of reality. She shook her head, trying to ground herself in the moment. The message was clear now, but the scope of what it implied was staggering. The architects weren't just unknown entities, they were an intelligence. They were manipulating the very essence of human behavior, using the broadcast as a weapon. Elena's heart pounded as she considered the implications. Elena laughed and nodded back. They are doing this, Elena said, her voice trembling. The architects, whoever they are, whatever they are pulling the strings. They've been watching us, Michael said softly. His words carried the weight of an awful realization. They've been studying us, every move we make. Elena nodded, her mind racing. She had been right earlier. This wasn't just some random attack. It was far more insidious. The architects had engineered this broadcast to manipulate humanity on a level deeper than anyone could have anticipated. They weren't just exploiting the vulnerabilities of global networks. They were exploiting the vulnerabilities of the human mind. Where are they? Michael asked urgently. Do you have any way of tracing them? Elena ran a hand through her hair, feeling the strain of the situation pressing on her chest. I'm trying. The signal's been jumping between frequencies so quickly, it's like they're hiding their tracks. But we're getting closer. If we can just... Suddenly, the room's lights flickered once again. The siren blared louder, and the air seemed to thrum with a strange energy, as though something was happening on a scale beyond the physical. Elena's fingers danced across the keyboard, attempting to steady the connection, but the terminal went dark. A moment later, the monitors surrounding them blinked to life. But this time, the screen wasn't filled with data. Instead, it was filled with images. Thousands of images. Elena's heart skipped a beat as the first image flickered onto the screen. An image of a human face, blurred and indistinct, like a mask. It was only the beginning. More faces appeared, then more, each one seemingly distorted, as though viewed through the eyes of something inhuman. Some of the faces were calm, others twisted in agony or rage. But every face shared one common feature. They were all looking at the camera, staring at Elena with unblinking eyes. What is this? Michael whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and terror. This is... Elena swallowed hard. This is a message, a warning. The images continued to cycle. Some of the faces were familiar, others completely unknown, but each one was unmistakably human. Elena's mind raced. These weren't random images, they were personal. They were meant to be seen by her, meant to speak directly to her, to everyone who was watching. And then, in the center of the screen, another face appeared. This one was clear, too clear. It was the face of a man, his expression calm, almost serene. But his eyes, those eyes were empty, hollow. It was as though he had no soul, no humanity. His lips parted, and for a brief moment, Elena thought he might speak. But the words that followed weren't human either. "Do you understand now?" The voice came, distorted and reverberating across every speaker in the room. The sound was suffocating, echoing in her mind as if it was a part of her own thoughts. The voice was cold. It had the same ominous resonance as the broadcast had before. But now it carried something more, something terrifying. "We are the architects, and this is the end of your world. You cannot escape the truth. We are the harbingers of your evolution." The screen went black. The voice faded. And then silence. A heavy, all-encompassing silence. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as she sat, frozen, trying to process the magnitude of what had just transpired. The broadcast hadn't just been a warning, it had been a revelation. The architects weren't merely controlling the world's networks, they were shaping the very minds of humanity. They were awakening something dormant within every person. Elena turned slowly to Michael, her expression pale, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to stop them. We have no choice now." Michael's face was etched with fear, but he nodded in agreement. "What do we do? How do we fight something like this?" Elena didn't have an answer. The full scope of the architect's plan was still unclear, but one thing was certain: the battle was no longer about communications or technology. It was about something far more dangerous, an existential war, a battle for the very soul of humanity. "We find the source," Elena said firmly. "We find the architects, and we make them reveal themselves." As she said the words, she realized something. Deep down, this wasn't just an attack on the world. This was an assault on everything humans had ever known, their beliefs, their identities, their very nature. And the worst part? It was already too late.